Hey guys, it's Courtney here with a video using the Engraved Flowers stamp set by Altenew. I'm going to start off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and this is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm using my Misty here. This is the first time I'm using this stamp set, so just in case I needed to stamp things twice, I prefer to use a stamp positioner, but this is not necessary. Going to start off with what will be my main image, and I'm just centering that in the middle of my card panel there. Stamp that with blackout ink by Ink on 3. Then I'm taking the other images within the stamp set, and I was able to fit 4 initially, and I'm kind of just arranging these around this main image, being careful not to overlap anything. You can certainly mask your images, but I was just being a little bit lazy, didn't feel like cutting out all of those masks, so I was just being careful as to make sure that I didn't overlap anything. And I did go ahead and stamp that with the same blackout ink because we are going to be Copic coloring this entire panel. But it's going to be simple Copic coloring. It's not going to be anything too involved or too detailed. So once I had those 4 images stamped out, I took one of the images that we'd already used to position that in what will be the lower left-hand corner where we're totally missing missing any flowers there, and I went ahead and stamped that, and then we'll move on to the Copic coloring. Like I said, the middle image there will be our main image, so I'm going to start by coloring that one. And for the flower, I'm going to be using the V markers, starting off with what was originally going to be my lightest color just to map out my darkest areas. For this particular petal, the darkest area will be on the base of it, as well as where it's kind of creased on the top. There are some lines within the illustration that will kind of guide you as to where those creases or folds are within the petal. Going in with the darkest color and kind of just going over those same areas that we had mapped out, blending that out with the V17 and going over those same lines or extending those lines out that we had created for the little creases in the petal. Now you'll want to extend this out in the same direction each time. So if you're going to shade to the left each and every time. You don't want to just thicken up the line. You want to just extend it off to one side. Doesn't really matter which side you choose. So once I got to what was going to be my lightest color, I realized that it was too much. It was too much of a highlight. So I ended up bringing in my V000 and ended up using that as my highlight color. So I'm actually using a 5 color blend here. Totally not necessary and not something that I planned, but being we colored the first petal that way, we kind of have to continue it throughout the entire image. So for this next petal, this one's kind of curved off to the side, and the lines within the image kind of show you that. So when I'm doing my flicking, I'm going with the direction of the petal or the direction of the lines within that illustration. Also, there is a little fold on the bottom part of that petal that I'm also concentrating on creating a shadow there just to kind of give it some shape. Using this same color combination as I did for the first petal, including that V000. And I'll just show you one more petal here, but I pretty much colored these all the same, just making sure to pay attention to the shape of the petal. For the petals that are behind the others, the base of these would be a little bit darker than the rest, just because the front petals would be casting a shadow on these ones. So you'll want to make sure that you add a little bit more darkness to the bottom of these ones, just because naturally they're in the back, they would naturally be darker. This one has that little notch in the top. You'll just want to make sure that you add a little bit of shading there. If you're not comfortable using your very darkest color, that's fine. Just as long as there's a little bit of a shadow there, you'll still get the idea of the shape of the petal. So like I said, colored the other 3 the same way, and we'll move on to the leaves and the stems of this flower. I'm going to bring out my YG 90 markers. Going to again start off with the lightest color for these 3 little leaves that are underneath the flower. And I know there's a term for this part of the flower, but for some reason, every time I start a voiceover, half of my vocabulary disappears. So going in again with the lightest color, then the darkest color, just concentrating the darkest areas being in the very center. And for the little leaf there that will be to the left when it's when it's right side up, I added a little bit of shading to the tip of that petal just because it is curved, and that will just give it a little bit more shape. Blended that out with the two midtones and then filled in the rest with the lightest color. We'll move on to the stem and the main leaves here. Now there's a couple different ways that you can color leaves, and I'll be honest with you, I'm still learning leaves. They intimidate me and they're not as easy to color as flowers are. So for this one, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm going to keep my shading on, basically in the center. But you can see on the sides of the leaf, it's kind of curved in a little bit. So I'm just going to create little C marks where it's curved in. And this will kind of give it some movement and give it some shape. Going in with the darkest color and just going over those same areas that we had mapped out with the lightest color. You want to make sure that your flicking from the center is in the same direction as the image itself. So where those lines are that kind of guide you, just make sure that your flicks are in that same direction. And also going over these little C marks that we had created with the lightest color. Going in with the darkest midtone, extending those flicks out a little bit further. Also, those little C marks will now become little V marks. And because we're just going to extend those out a little bit further now. Same thing with the lightest midtone, extending the flicks from the center and also making those little V's that we had created a little bit longer and a little bit wider. And finally going in with the YG93, which was our lightest color, and just blending all of that out. And you'll see how that gives it just a little bit of shape, more shape, I guess is the best word for it. So for the other leaf, I pretty much colored that the same exact way. This one's curved a little bit, so my flick lines in the middle were a little bit different, but for the most part, colored the same way. Now for the flowers that are on the outer edge of my panel, these are not my main image, as I said before, so I'm going to be coloring these all in a gray scale. So I'm using my cool gray markers as well as my warm gray markers. For the flowers, I'm going to be using my cool grays, and for the leaves and the stems, I'll switch over to the warm grays just to kind of give it a little bit of difference between the two. For this flower, it's pretty much the same as that main image, just concentrating my darkest areas being in the very center of the petals, and also just paying attention to those little creases that are in the top of each of the petals. And I'm not too worried about the shading on these particular flowers around the edges just because they're not my main image. That's not where the eye is going to be going when somebody looks at the card. So there's a lot of flowers here, and it did take me a little bit of time to color them. I will not show you all of the coloring, but I wanted to keep the shading pretty simple. I'll show you just one more flower, one more cluster of flowers here. Now this one has quite a few petals, and you'll notice that for whenever I'm coloring with grays, whether it's coloring something or creating a shadow, I usually go right in with my darkest color just because I find that the grays blend very well together. So I'm starting off with that darkest color for each of these petals, concentrating the darkest areas being on the base of the petal as always. But being there's so many petals, there's a lot that are kind of behind another. So this would create a shadow. So you want to make sure that you just basically outline where they overlap one another, and that will create your shadow for you. Especially the C7 is a super dark color, so you're going to lose that black line that we had from the ink that we stamped the image with. So you want to make sure that you do outline that area so that you can preserve that shadow. So next, going in with the C5, and I'm just going to extend those flicks out from the C7 and also the shadows that we had created. So where we outlined those areas where those shadows would be, all I'm doing is making those lines just a little bit thicker with that C5, Again, making sure that I add that shadow only in one direction and not add it, not go right over that line and extend it on both sides. Going in with the C3, same thing, just leaving a little bit of a highlight area for my C1. For the larger petals, I did leave a little bit of white on the very tips, but for the smaller ones, I filled them in completely with that C1. I did not color the center of this flower with the C markers. I left that for the warm grays just to just so that it wasn't all one big cluster of the cool grays. So for the middle of the flower as well as this stem and leaf, we're going to move on to the warm grays, again going right in with the darkest color because these also blend very well together. For the center of the flower, you really don't have to do much shading, if any shading at all, because these little teeny tiny images are so super tiny. It's kind of a waste of time to do all the shading, but I figured I had the markers out for the leaves and the stems. I may as well use all four for the center of the flower as well. Now, some of the images that are kind of hanging off the card panel, it's kind of hard to tell what they are, but if you can't tell, neither can anybody else, so just keep that in mind. So once my coloring was done, I wasn't happy with the contrast that I had on the main image. So I'm going in with the darkest color that I had used, and I'm just adding a few more shadows where the very, very darkest areas will be, and pretty much just going over those same areas, maybe adding a few flicks in the center and kind of going over those shadow areas where the petal is creased or folded over. And I didn't go back in with all of my markers or all of my V markers to blend this out. I kind of left this as is just in order to get that contrast that I was looking for that I just didn't have initially. So I wasn't liking the way this was looking. So I knew I had to do something. It was going to be a one layer card. I fixed up all of the areas that my coloring was a little bit messy with my colorless blender and ended up trimming down my panel just a little bit. I didn't measure here, but I kind of just eyeballed it and took a little bit off. Then I decided to add a drop shadow for my main image. Because I want this to be my main image, I want this to really pop off the page, even though it's a one layer card at this point. So I'm going to take my C markers again and start off with my C5. So for the drop shadows, I typically don't start with the C7. That's just a little bit too dark. So I'm just going to outline the image off to the left-hand side. So underneath some of the petals and off to the left of some of the sections of the petal, I guess, if that makes any sense, as well as the leaves and the stem. Then I'm going to take my C3 and I'm just going to extend those lines out a little bit further, and then finally going in with the C1 and extend that even further. And this will kind of just make it appear as if it is a dimensional. It's popping off the page. So for my sentiment, I wanted to kind of keep with that purple color, and I didn't have any cardstock that matched it. So I'm going to take my V09 and this is a scrap piece of Nina Solar White, just going to color in the one side of it, I guess. And you want to make sure that this is completely dry, even though it's dry to the touch. If it's cold, the paper's still wet. So I should have waited because I didn't get great coverage here, but I did treat it with my anti-static tool, stamped my sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and went ahead and heat set that. Now just keep this in mind that if you don't have cardstock or colored cardstock that matches your images, this is an easy way to make everything match perfectly by using the Copic markers or whatever medium that you're using, whether it be the zigs or colored pencils, anything. This is a way to get everything to match perfectly. So in order to continue with this, I trimmed down my panel a little bit more. I wanted a little bit of a border. It was a little bit too plain for me still. So I took another piece of Nina Solar White, and this is cut down to 4¼ by 5½, which is slightly larger than what my panel is now. And I went over around all 4 edges with that same V09, and this will make it appear that it's layered on a purple piece of cardstock, even though we just colored the edges. Adhered everything down to an A2 size card base, and then popped up my little sentiment strip there with some Scotch foam tape. And that is it. I did add a little bit of sparkle just to my main flower there. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.